The blue lights hit your rearview mirror before your brain even catches up. 1 second you're just driving, maybe thinking about dinner or a call you forgot to return, and the next your chest tightens, your grip on the wheel changes, and there's that unmistakable feeling. Something just shifted. You pull over, engine idling, hands suddenly very aware of themselves. And then it happens. A calm voice, maybe even friendly. "Hey, we're not here to make things difficult. We just want to talk." That sentence sounds harmless, almost reassuring, and that's exactly why it catches so many people off guard. Have you ever been in a situation where an officer said something like that, and you weren't sure whether you actually had to answer or not? Tell me in the comments what happened, what you said and how it turned out, because later on, I'm going to explain why that exact moment matters more than most people realize, and why a lot of drivers unintentionally talk themselves into trouble right there, without even noticing it. Let me walk you through how this plays out in the real world, not in theory, not in a courtroom, but on the side of the road where your adrenaline is high and your decisions are fast. When an officer says, "We just want to talk," that is not a legal instruction. It's not a command. It's not even technically a request that you are required to comply with. It's a conversational opening. But psychologically, it does something very specific. It lowers your guard. Think about it. If an officer walked up and said, "I'm conducting an investigation, and anything you say can be used against you," you'd immediately tighten up. You'd become cautious. You'd start thinking about your rights. But, "We just want to talk?" That feels different. It feels informal, human, safe. And that's where most people make their first mistake. Drivers often respond instinctively. "Sure. Okay. Yeah, what's going on?" And just like that, they've stepped into a conversation they don't fully understand. Now here's the part that people don't always grasp. During a traffic stop, officers are doing far more than checking your license and registration. They are observing you constantly. Every movement, every hesitation, every word choice, your tone, your eye contact, how quickly you answer, whether your story changes even slightly. So when they say, "We just want to talk," what they're really doing is opening a window. They're giving you space to provide information voluntarily. And once you start talking, it becomes very hard to control how much you give away. Let's slow this down and step into a realistic scenario. You're pulled over. The officer approaches. "Good evening. Do you know why I stopped you?" Already this is a classic setup. Most people either guess or admit something. "Was I speeding?" Or, "Yeah, I might have been going a little fast." Right there, you've made a statement. It may seem minor, but you've essentially helped establish a basis for the stop. Then comes the softer shift. "Where are you headed tonight?" Now it feels casual, almost like small talk. And this is where that earlier phrase often comes in. "Look, we're not trying to make things complicated, we just want to talk." And this is the moment I want you to pay attention to, because what you say next matters more than the question itself. Most people answer, they explain. "I'm just coming from a friend's house, heading home, coming back from work." Seems harmless, right? But now imagine the officer asks a follow-up. "Which friend? What part of town? What do you do for work?" Now you're in a chain of questions, and each answer builds on the last. Here's what's happening behind the scenes. The officer isn't just listening to your words. They're evaluating consistency. They're watching for hesitation. They're comparing your answers to what they observe. Time of night, location, your behavior, even your vehicle. If something doesn't line up even slightly, that can escalate the interaction. Now let's talk about the words that can change everything and why they're so uncomfortable for people to say. Because they go against your instincts, because they feel awkward, because they create tension. But they protect you. A simple, calm response like this: "I prefer not to answer any questions." That's it. No attitude, no aggression, no hostility, just a clear boundary. And here's the important part. How you say it matters just as much as what you say. If you say it defensively, with irritation, you raise the temperature of the interaction. If you say it calmly, almost neutrally, It communicates something very different. It tells the officer you understand your rights, and you're choosing to exercise them without escalating the situation. Now, a lot of people worry about this. They think, if I say that, won't it make me look suspicious? That's a very common fear, and it's also where a lot of misinformation lives. Officers may interpret behavior in many ways, but exercising your right to remain silent is not illegal. It does not give them automatic grounds to escalate a stop. However, and this is important, it can change the tone of the interaction. And that's where understanding human behavior comes in. Some officers will respect it immediately. They'll shift back to the purpose of the stop, license, registration, maybe a citation, and then you're on your way. Others may push. They might repeat the question. Come on, it's just a simple question. Why not answer? If you've got nothing to hide, what's the problem? Now you're under subtle pressure. And this is where people crack. Not because they're guilty of anything serious, but because they're uncomfortable with silence and confrontation. Let me tell you something most people don't realize. Silence feels louder during a traffic stop than talking does. There's a pause. The officer is looking at you. You're aware of the moment stretching, and your brain wants to fill that gap. That's when people start talking again. They backtrack. They soften their stance. I mean, I'm just heading home, nothing crazy. And just like that, the boundary disappears. Now let's talk about a situation that gets even more complicated. You're in the car with a passenger. The officer starts asking them questions too. Where are you guys coming from? Do you know each other well? And suddenly your passenger answers freely. Maybe they're nervous. Maybe they think they're helping. But their version of events doesn't match yours exactly. Now there's inconsistency. And inconsistency is something officers pay close attention to. Even small differences, like one person saying you came from a restaurant and another saying a friend's house, can raise suspicion. This is how a routine stop starts to expand. And here's something else people overlook. When officers hold onto your documents, your license, your registration, that interaction is not over. You're not free to leave. And during that time, they may continue asking questions. The longer the interaction goes, the more opportunities there are for mistakes. Now imagine this. The officer walks back to your car after a few minutes. Everything checks out, but listen, we just want to talk real quick. Mind if I ask you a couple more questions? This is where that earlier phrase comes back again. And now you're thinking, well, things seem fine. Maybe I should just cooperate. But this is often where the purpose of the stop begins to shift. Because once the original reason for the stop is resolved, any continued questioning starts to fall into a different category legally, and your response becomes even more important. If you continue engaging voluntarily, you're essentially extending the interaction yourself. Now let's address another moment that catches people off guard. Would you mind stepping out of the vehicle? This can feel intimidating, and legally, in many situations, officers can ask drivers to step out. But what happens after you step out is where things can change quickly. Standing outside the car, you're more exposed. The conversation becomes more direct. There's less of a barrier between you and the officer. And again, the tone may soften. Look, we're just trying to figure a few things out. We just want to talk. At this point, many people feel like refusing to answer questions would be rude or suspicious. But here's the reality. Politeness and silence are not opposites. You can be respectful and still decline to answer. I understand, officer, but I'd prefer not to answer any questions. That balance, respectful but firm, is something very few drivers practice, and it makes a significant difference. Now let's get into something that doesn't get talked about enough. Body language. Officers are trained to observe it, but even beyond training, it's human instinct. If you're fidgeting, avoiding eye contact, speaking quickly, or over-explaining, it can create an impression, whether accurate or not. And here's the twist. Sometimes people who are completely innocent act more nervous than those who aren't. Why? Because they're worried about saying the wrong thing. They're trying too hard to appear cooperative. They're overthinking every word. And that leads to mistakes. They volunteer extra details. They correct themselves mid-sentence. They add information that was never asked for. And each of those things creates more material to analyze. Now, I want to touch on something that might challenge what you've heard before. There's a common belief that being completely open and talkative will make the situation go smoother. Sometimes it does, but not always. Because talking doesn't just build rapport, it also builds a record. Everything you say can be remembered, noted, or even recorded. And if something later becomes relevant, those earlier statements don't disappear. So when you hear, "We just want to talk," understand that the conversation isn't just casual. It exists in a legal context, even if it doesn't feel like it. Now let's bring this back to something practical. What should you actually do in that moment? You're pulled over. The officer says, "We just want to talk." You stay calm. You keep your movement steady. You provide required documents when asked. And when the questions go beyond identification or the reason for the stop, you draw a line. Quietly, respectfully, clearly. I prefer not to answer any questions. You don't argue. You don't explain why. You don't justify it. Because the more you explain your refusal, the more you're talking, and that defeats the purpose. Now, will this always lead to a quick and smooth stop? No. Sometimes it may feel a bit more tense. There may be pauses. The officer may try a different approach. They might change tone, from friendly to slightly firm, or even mildly frustrated. That's part of the dynamic. But tension is not the same as wrongdoing, and discomfort is not the same as danger. What matters is staying consistent, because inconsistency, changing your approach mid-stop, is one of the biggest mistakes people make. They start off cautious, then loosen up, or they talk freely, then suddenly try to pull back. And that shift is noticeable. Now let me leave you with something to think about. Most people don't get into serious trouble during traffic stops because of what they did before the stop. They get into trouble because of what they say during it. Small admissions, slight contradictions, extra details that seemed harmless at the time. And it often starts with a simple sentence. "We just want to talk." It sounds easy, it sounds safe. But if you understand what's really happening in that moment, you start to see it differently. You realize that silence, used correctly, isn't suspicious. It's controlled. It's deliberate. And sometimes, it's the only thing standing between a routine stop and a situation that goes much further than you ever expected. So the next time you see those lights in your mirror, and you hear that familiar line, you won't just hear the words. You'll understand the moment behind them. And that changes everything.